Welcome back to the podcast. This episode, we are joined by Mr. Jim Gray, co-founder of Canadian Hunter Exploration, one of Canada's largest natural gas producers before its sale in 2001 for approximately $3.4 billion. Among his many awards, Mr. Gray has been inducted into the Alberta Order of Excellence, the Order of Canada, the Calgary Business Hall of Fame, and the Canadian Business Hall of Fame. Mr. Gray was awarded an Honorary Doctor of Laws degree in 1991 by the University of Calgary and the Energy Person of the Year Award from the Energy Council of Canada. Mr. Gray is also a founder and former chairman of Calgary Academy, honorary chair of the Canada West Foundation, and honorary life director of the Calgary YMCA. Mr. Gray is currently chairman of the energy group of Brookfield Asset Management, with previous directorships including Sequence Energy, Brookfield Asset Management, Phoenix Technology Services, Emera, Hudson's Bay Company, and Canadian National Railway. Among other things, we discuss the Can Hunter days, pioneering the Deep Basin, and 90 years of staying active. This podcast episode is powered by ATB Capital Markets. ATB Capital Markets provides financial solutions and strategic advisory services to help businesses thrive. With a track record of successful deal execution, ATB is a full-service investment dealer with a deep understanding and commitment to the industries it serves. Visit atbcapitalmarkets.com for more information. This episode is brought to you by the Canadian Gas Association. The Canadian Gas Association represents Canada's natural gas delivery industry, whose members include distribution companies, transmission companies, equipment manufacturers, and other service providers. The Canadian Gas Association members deliver safe, reliable, and affordable natural gas to meet 38% of Canada's energy needs. Visit cga.ca to learn more about Canada's natural gas. Good morning, Mr. Jim Gray. It's an honor to talk to you this morning.
Thank you very much. Great you could be here.
I really appreciate your time, so thank you very much. For the listener, you were a co-founder of Canadian Hunter Exploration. You're a geologist, philanthropist. Some might say you are the godfather of the Deep Basin along with Mr. John Masters. You have a family, you're an entrepreneur, you're a past board member of Brookfield. But how would you define yourself nowadays?
Well, first of all, I'm very active. I'm somewhat over 90 now, but I believe in being active. I interface with a lot of young people and startups. I'm involved in a lot of not-for-profits in the city and in public policy. I get involved in that, and I'm involved in it as recently as this week. So I really do believe in staying active.
You're a big swimmer, too, if I'm correct. Did you get a swim in this morning?
No, unfortunately, the YMCA over at Eau Claire was sold, and I live right a minute away from that Y. But it is going to open in March or April as a private club, and I may find myself back in the pool. I hope I do.
I think you used to swim every morning. Right?
I did for many, many years. I used to count the number of lengths I did. I swam from coast to coast over 340,000 lengths of the pool over about close to 30 years.
All at the YMCA?
All at the YMCA, all in the same lane, and all in the morning. We would gather there at 5:30 each morning.
Maybe to start at the beginning, I thought for the purposes of our conversation today, we could go chronological, more or less. If I'm correct, you were originally born in Kirkland Lake, Ontario.
Right. It's a gold mining town, and I kind of got interested in geology at the mine, in the assay office, with prospectors coming in. And then I went to school in Ontario and in Vancouver. And then I moved to Calgary in the early 60s, and we started Canadian Hunter in 1973.
At one point, you were literally working in a coal mine when you were a teenager.
Well, it was a gold mine.
Okay.
And yes, I worked underground as a summer student, and a lot of my friends And it was exciting. Way down, down as far as 10,000 feet down. And it was in Kirkland Lake in the gold mine.
Just earn a little money as a teenager, more or less.
Yes.
That must have spawned the interest in geology?
Yeah, it was the assay office, and there'd be prospectors coming in, and it'd be, by the way, all through the winter, it would be 10, 20, 30 below, and they'd come in with their samples, and they were prospecting, and then the mines would all assay the and get the value of the samples, and for an option to explore and with the prospectors. And these were tough, bearded men, all men, living in tents, living out in the bush at 10 and 20, 30 below in the winter, and with the black flies and the et cetera in the summer. Tough people, but they really inspired me. I was fascinated with their stories and with their single determination. They kept at it and at it and at it, and they were always optimistic that the next rock they were going to turn over was going to be the big winner. And of course, success was very rare, but there was some success, but that's where I got interested.
Working in the gold mine spawned the interest in geology. You went on to become a geologist? Where did you go to school?
In Vancouver. And then I came here as a summer student and worked with different companies in the summer for 3 or 4 summers. Then worked for Kerr McGee Corporation as an exploration geologist and sat on wells all over Alberta and northeast BC. Loved that. I really enjoyed that part of my background because I was living at the rigs and talking to the roughnecks, and that it was a lot of fun. And you were kind of your own boss. You're out on your own, and you traveled all over. So that was interesting.
Do you remember the first day you got to Calgary?
I do. I had an old car, 1938 car with a big stick shift. And I arrived in Calgary, and I didn't know where I was going to stay, so I stayed at the YMCA. The YMCA over here on 6th Avenue had little kind of one room. They had a washroom at the end of the hall, but they had little places where you could stay. And guys like Doc Seaman, he's no longer with us, but Doc stayed at the Y. I stayed at the Y. Many of the people that I knew stayed at the Y for the first week or maybe the 2 weeks, and then found more permanent residences. But the Y doesn't have those residences any longer. But many of us spent the first week or 2 in Calgary at the downtown YMCA.
You made the decision to come out west.
Yeah.
What motivated you to come?
Well, the oil and gas industry Leduc was in the late 50s, and it had started to grow in the 60s, and it was exciting. And I did consider going into hard rock mining like Kirkland Lake and exploring. But I then came here as a summer student and did some field work, went into the Northwest Territories, went into northern Saskatchewan, and I just got the bug. And so I came back and worked for Great Plains Development Company.
Did you get a sense of the opportunity in soft rock in Alberta?
Yeah, the city was very, very exciting at that time. It is today, but it was very. Everybody was. I hardly had any friends that were native Albertans. They were all from Ontario or British Columbia or the Maritimes. My wife came from southern Manitoba, and so we were all immigrants, if you will, in that sense that we were all new to Alberta. And then the mountains were a huge part of that new group. We would ski and climb and meet up in the mountains and hike winter and summer whenever we had a moment free into the mountains. And that was a wonderful experience as well.
As a fellow skier, I guess I have to say favorite ski hill, if you had your choice.
Well, I ran the ski patrol at Lake Louise
Really?
for years. The CSPS, Canadian Ski Patrol System. And we did all of the ski patrolling on the weekends at Lake Louise. And then they had a paid patrol that did during the week. And I was in charge of Lake Louise. And what that meant was spending hours on the phone getting people to get up there and on the weekend. And then we had little huts at the top of Larch and the top of the various hills. And I made a lot of very, very good friends, different friends than, the oil and gas end, but it was a good chunk of our life. And then when we got married in the early 60s and we had children, and so the family responsibilities kind of took over. And so my ski patrolling days, I ski patrolled for about 10 years. Then I went on to other things. I did a lot of cross-country skiing with Hans Moser and Leo Grillmeyer and all those, Peter Furman. And I still, Hans has passed away, as has Leo, but Peter Furman is still with us, and I see Peter frequently on weekends still.
So suppose you would have crossed paths with Charlie Locke?
Well, I did, yes, but very casually. I wasn't so much in the social end up there. I was skiing, put on the skins and head out to Mount Columbia or someplace into the Stanley Mitchell hut, the various Alpine Club huts, etc. And my wife and I, and to this day, my grandchildren are ski tours, big time ski tours.
Charlie did the podcast in November.
Oh, did he?
Which is why I asked.
Yeah.
So it's a small world.
It's a small world.
Did you always want to be an entrepreneur?
Well, I always wanted to do things. It was kind of in my DNA. During the Second World War, I was born in 1933. So I was 10 years old in 1943 in the middle of the war. And I can remember we would have huge efforts, 10-year-olds, a group of 10-year-olds, in gathering cardboard and paper and tinfoil and aluminum for the war effort. And that became a passion during the war for the young people. And there were competitions and we were trying to win. And I believe in entrepreneurship. And when we started Canadian Hunter in 1973, John and I had a philosophy about where the big gas was. It was under the water, not over the water. And we just decided that we were going to start a company. And we didn't have a strategic plan. We didn't have anybody to lean on. We did it ourselves. Back in those days, you didn't have any private capital. We didn't use any consultants. We just decided we needed $5 million a year for 5 years. And we wanted to start a company. We came up with the name Canadian Hunter. And it wasn't all easy, but it wasn't all tough. I mean, when you look back, you tend to think that it's nice and smooth, but when you're living it, it's very erratic. It's very volatile. And then we had associations with Noranda, which was one of Canada's biggest mining companies. And so we were able to ultimately make a deal with Noranda.
Before you started Can Hunter, you were working at Kerr McGee.
Correct.
For the listener, what was Kerr McGee?
Well, it was out of Oklahoma City. It was an exploration and production company, mainly in the Gulf of Mexico, but they had a Canadian operation up here, a small one. And it was Senator Kerr and Dean McGee, and they kind of inspired us. And my partner, John Masters, grew up in Oklahoma, and he was working for Kerr McGee down in Oklahoma City, and then he moved to Calgary. He was about 4 or 5 years older than I was, and he came to run the office, and then he hired me. And we were relatively successful individually, but we were combined, we were more successful than we were individually. In other words, 2 and 2 equaled 5 or 6, not just 4. And so but Kerr-McGee was, in fact, when we first started, our office wasn't even downtown. It was out on 17th Avenue. And then we moved downtown with Kerr-McGee, and then we started Canadian Hunter in 1973.
How long were you at Kerr-McGee?
I was at Kerr-McGee maybe 10 years, 12 years, and many trips to Oklahoma City. And we were relatively successful. We found the Clive Field, which is up northeast of Red Deer, and was what they call a D2 and a D3 field. It was very, very profitable. And that was before John came up here from Oklahoma City.
So you got a lot of your early training in at Kerr-McGee, which...
Yeah, I got the early training at Kerr-McGee, and then my breakthrough interest was down in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They have the world's biggest oil show, and it's just all the equipment, the drilling equipment, seismic equipment, production equipment, all the different equipment. So I went and visited it. And then I was driving, and we had a little shack at Harvey Heights up here in Canmore. And I can remember driving up to, in the 60s, about 64, 65, with my wife, saying, we need an oil show in Calgary like Tulsa. And her response to me was, well, what are you going to do about it? And that became kind of the theme of my life, frankly. What are you going to do about it? And so that led to the Canadian Petroleum Exposition, which I chaired the outdoor exhibit. Jerry D'Arcy, who passed away, but he was the chairman of the whole thing. But I was in charge of the outdoor exhibit, which was the main exhibit. And I took 6 months off my job to do it, and they were very supportive. And it was a spectacular success. And that sort of got me engaged in the industry more generally, because that was big news when we did it.
You were a co-founder of Canadian Hunter Exploration, like we mentioned, but maybe to get it from the source, what was Canadian Hunter Exploration?
Well, OPEC started in about 1971, 72, and the oil and gas prices started to go up. And John had a lot of American experience with higher wellhead prices than we were experiencing. And he had a lot of experience in sandstones and in conglomerates. And my experience was all in carbonates, and like Leduc and Redwater and all the historic fields. And also, as I mentioned, Clive and the other elements. And so we could see that with higher prices, there was going to be a huge opportunity, because higher prices meant that the quality of the rock, the quality of the reservoirs could be somewhat diminished and still make a profit. And so we just decided that we were going to start a company. And John went down because he was a good friend of Dean McGee's, Senator Kerr. He said to them, well, I'm going to leave Kerr-McGee, and we're going to start a company. And Dean McGee said, well, what's Jim going to do? And we had talked about this many, many times, but we had no strategic plan. We had no legal definition of what we were doing, or no accountants, just the two of us. And so John said, well, Jim's going to leave, and the two of us are going to start this company. And so John gets on the phone to me later that day, and he said, well, Jim, I've got some news for you. Well, I said, what is it? He said, well, I quit today. And I said, holy jumping, I never thought you had it in you to do it, because you grew up with Kerr-McGee and you're from Oklahoma, and that's wonderful. He said, but that isn't all I did today. I said, what else did you do? He said, I quit for you too. I said, well, normally you'd talk to me first, but that's fine. And so we just started. We needed $5 million a year for 5 years. And of course, we went to Noranda first, and they said ultimately that they would take half of it. And we said, that's great, because the first half is the hardest half. We'll find the other half. And we went all through the Canadian business field looking for companies that had big energy consumption. Forest companies, steel companies, mining companies, people that consumed a lot of energy. And interestingly, we had Noranda, but the next 17 companies we went to, including Stelco and Dofasco and, Inco and McNeil Bodell, all of them, they all turned us down. But then turned out that the copper prices went up, and Noranda was very sensitive to copper prices. So they said they'll take it all. And so that's how we got started in June of 73.
Where did the name Canadian Hunter come
Just from our kitchen table. We were sitting around with our kids, and they were dreaming up names. To this day, I don't know who came up with the name. Could have been one of our kids. It could have been my wife. It could have been John's wife. We came up with the name Canadian Hunter because we were hunters, and we were going to be Canadian. And so it seemed logical to us.
The value proposition was with rising oil prices, you could take advantage of.
Yeah, we felt that higher prices, you've got to make money. And so at low prices, which was pre-OPEC low prices, there'd be all kinds of wells that had oil and gas in them, but they weren't of sufficient quantity to make any money. But when the price went up, then you could make money on lower production wells. And we actually could map a couple of places where there were fields that were economic at the new price, but were not economic when they were drilled. And that was our pitch. We can save you money on your energy prices, and we can develop production, and it'll offset your costs, and it'll lower your costs of doing business, whether you're in the lumber business or whether you're in the steel business. Stelco and Dofasco, and Stelco almost joined us. But then in the fall of 72, John and I always went as a pair, because we always believed that it's best to have two people. One's listening and one's talking. And the one that's listening is sensing, how is it going over? What are they thinking? Are they with us or not with us? And so we worked as a team, and we would meet, and we always worked from the top down. We figured a way of meeting the CEO every time. And we had 20 different ways of meeting the CEO. And he didn't know us. And there weren't any women CEOs back in those days. There are many today, and that's great. But we would figure a way to meet them, and because we believed in working from the top down. And it was fun. It was exciting.
So I read, like you said, you got turned down 17 times on your first equity raise, but you eventually got the money. And was the idea to drill a well and hope it turned out? How did you think about the risk?
Well, when we started, the company was sold 28 years later for $3.4 billion, and it was a very successful run. But we drilled low-risk wells to start with. And like in Lloydminster, we drilled a whole bunch of wells in Lloydminster, but they were 10-acre offsets and very closely spaced together. And that gave our backers confidence. And that gave us, we always had spent a lot of time communicating with Noranda. No secrets, everything out in the open. And everything was trust, and etc. And so we drilled many oil and gas wells, but they were tiny little wells, and they were low risk. And then later on, that morphed into the Deep Basin, where we found the big gas.
This podcast episode is sponsored by Conate Water Solutions. Do you need cost-effective water sourcing options to supply your next drilling or completions program? Conate Water Solutions is a specialized hydrogeology company focused on water well drilling, testing, and water management services in Western Canada and Texas. Contact info@conatewater.com or check out conatewater.com for more details. This episode is sponsored by 360 Engineering and Environmental Consulting. 360 is dedicated to shaping a better future by championing responsible development with a forward-thinking approach. As established leaders in the site closure market, 360 provides innovative solutions to address complex engineering and environmental challenges. From safeguarding communities to preserving our planet, 360 is committed to making a meaningful impact at every step. Discover the 360 vision and learn more at 360eec.com. So do you remember your first well? Was it a sleepless night?
No, three of the first 5 wells we drilled were dry holes. And I can't remember. We had a guy that I still see now and then, Earl Hawks, who had an incredible memory. He would remember, but I don't remember. But 3 of the first 5 were dry. But we would always phone Noranda first, and we would tell them, we thought we would get this. And so we developed a trust, and we developed a very sound relationship with them so that they could tolerate. We told them, that's just natural in our business. You're going to drill dry holes.
Yeah.
And so, but then gradually the targets got bigger and bigger and bigger until we ended up in the Deep Basin.
And so you took the cash flow from the 4th well.
Well, it wasn't quite that specific, but I can remember definitively that 3 of the first 5 were dry. And then we started finding stuff, little stuff, not big stuff, not headline stuff, but it developed confidence with people.
Enough to pay the bills.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was that a stressful period of time?
Well, we had the philosophy that we didn't want to take on a lot of risk. We wanted to get some income. We wanted to pay our way. We wanted to have this as slightly positive cash flow. And it didn't have to be, we didn't have to shoot out the lights, but we had to get the platform. The foundation of the company had to be put in place. And it was put in place. There was a very close friend, now passed away, Jay Christensen, who led our Lloydminster campaign. And then we had another campaign down in southern Alberta. And then from that, we made the leap to the Deep Basin.
So your proposition to, I can't remember, the Noranda?
Yeah, Noranda.
Was you give them back their money eventually, or was it a dividend? How did you sell it to them?
Well, we just sold it with community. We built bridges with them, with all kinds of people at Noranda. Alf Powis, who was the CEO, was very, very supportive. Actually, a Calgarian, Dave Mitchell, who was the first chairman of the Alberta Energy Company, and I worked with Dave at Great Plains many, many years before that. He was on the board of Noranda, and he was very supportive of us. And I was always very, very generous. But Noranda never got the proper amount of credibility because they stuck with us. And we went out of our way to communicate with them. We would talk to them on the phone. We would visit them out here. We got them to bring the board out here. So we had the board of directors. So it was personal. And we developed a solid reputation with them.
So their investment paid off.
Yeah. Oh, it paid off huge. Noranda was bought by Brookfield. And by this time, John had passed away. And I ended up on the board of Brookfield. And I can remember being at the board meeting when Burlington bought Canadian Hunter. We were a private company for many, many years. And then we went public. And our shares did it very, very well. But I knew that when we went public, it was probably the end of the company because there'd be somebody that would pay a huge price for it and we'd lose it. And that's what happened. A bunch of Prudential out of New York and others made a huge amount of money. There was an enormous increase in price. And so Burlington bought it. And I stayed on the board of Brookfield. I didn't vote to sell it. I abstained from the voting. Canadian Hunter, in many ways, wasn't a company. It was a family. We had really good people and really thoughtful people. And they were skilled and they were proud, but there weren't any jerks at Canadian Hunter. And we tried to suppress any big egos that anybody had. And it was more family than in many ways than it was a corporation. What we did was take very modest salaries, but we got a share of the profits. And we said, if there are any profits, we'd like a share of them. And 12.5%. And that worked out very well.
Mr. John Masters was your partner in the company. Who is John Masters, and how did you guys meet?
John was working for Kerr McGee in Oklahoma City. He was a geologist, really a smart geologist, a really good guy. And he and I really hit it off. He was kind of Mr. Inside. I was Mr. Outside. But we were both geologists. Dean McGee got the idea that Canada was going to have a big opportunity, so he moved John up here in the middle 60s. And then John had to hire some exploration geologists, and I went and interviewed with him, and he hired me. And then from then on, we had a lot in common. He was in the mountains all the time, very big outdoors. His kids and our kids got along. And so John and I really hit it off. And he was really, in many respects, we were both basically relatively successful geologists, not spectacular success, relatively successful geologists. But we worked together. We would talk 5, 10, 20 times a day, maybe for a minute or 2 minutes or occasionally whatever. And we just had this vision that we could build a company. And so it worked out. It worked out very well. I can remember when he came up, but I had met him down in Oklahoma City, so I knew him. And we were both in the mountains all the time, and the family. I can remember the first day up at Bow Summit. And Bow Summit there's Bow Lake and Bow Glacier at where the Bow River starts. And Bow Summit was early skiing in the fall. And I remember taking John and his family up to Bow Summit, and it was their first day on skis. And, of course, they were falling right and falling left, but it worked out very well. And he loved the mountains. And so the two of us really hit it off. Quite different personalities, but my interest has always been much more out in the community and working with not-for-profits and building bridges before we needed them, and all that kind of stuff. John had a real big technical network down in the States, principally. And so John really led the inspirational work for the Deep Basin. And I contributed to it, but no, I did. John was the leader of that. And but the two of us, it worked out very well.
Where was the Can Hunter offices originally, and do you remember your first day there?
Yeah, I don't remember the first day, but we were at the corner of 4th and 4th over here, and it was a little office. In fact, George Brookman, have you interviewed George? He was working for one of the real estate companies, and we made a deal with George, and we wrote with our own check. We were spending putting up our own money, even after Naranda agreed to fund us. It took a while to get everything started. So George was reminding me the other day that he put us into our first office building, and it was just a small little. We didn't have very many employees.
Some people would say you and John were the godfathers of the Deep Basin, a section of Canadian energy representing trillions of dollars. For the listener, what is the Deep Basin?
Well, it's a little difficult to express without a map, but fundamentally we're taught that there's natural gas, and then there's oil, and then there's water. The Deep Basin reverses this. The Deep Basin, which is in front of the Rocky Mountains, where the rocks get thick and they dip to the west. There were about 300 or 400 wells, and John met some folks down in Houston that did a lot of them. Lloyd Fons was his name, and Larry Meckel and Bob Snyder. We used to call them our Houston Mafia because they brought American technology to our deep basin right at the time when the oil and gas prices were taking off. And they noticed that the deep part of the section was all gas saturated, even below water, and we couldn't understand it. And we didn't care. We just knew it was there. So we started buying land and started drilling wells, and the rest is kind of history. But it was our American friends, and one or two of whom are still with us, still talking to them. I don't work with them any longer, of course, but I've got fond memories of them, and they helped us understand. But fundamentally, it was gas underwater, and it was in the deep basin. It was in the thick part of the section, and there was enormous volumes of gas there.
When did you start to realize the potential?
The very first well was a recompletion of an old Texaco well, because people were looking for Devonian oil and gas production below the Cretaceous Jurassic sands that we gas saturated, and they weren't paying any attention to the sands. Gas wasn't a big deal, and furthermore, they looked like they were tight sands, and they were not interesting. So we went in and saw those old wells, and I've still got some of the maps. We noticed that, God, it's all saturated. Every time there's some porosity and some permeability, it was gas saturated. So we didn't understand fully the physics, and we didn't understand how the gas was trapped entirely, but we didn't care. It was there. And so we started buying land. Huge amounts of land. I remember that we had a budget of, I can't remember how much, but we had spent all of our budget by February of the year. And we had to go back to the board and point out, and we always used to say, well, people keep posting all this land. And of course we were posting it. And then we'd go to Noranda and Alf, and he knew exactly what we were doing. And he'd say, well, we got to buy this land. So they'd go to the board and get more money. And finally we ended up with a huge land spread and started drilling wells. We had maybe 10 rigs working at one time up there and built big gas plants. And then we ultimately built a deep cut facility that took the liquids out of the gas. And it was a wonderful story.
One of the subsects within the Deep Basin was the Elmworth Field?
Yeah.
Do you remember when John discovered the Elmworth Field?
I can remember John and I and Larry and Bob. The discovery of the field was a recompletion of a Texaco well. In other words, they drilled a well, and they didn't pay any attention to these sands, and they didn't find what they were looking for down deep, so they abandoned the well. Well, we re-entered the well and perforated the gas section and did a bit of not a big frac, but did a small frac on it, and it started flowing gas at fairly substantial levels. And that was the beginning of the whole thing.
So did you think to yourself, we need to capture this play? And what were you thinking? You had to go buy more land, or?
Yeah. I mean, we were both very, in football terms, we were the offensive team. Both of us felt we were very aggressive. We wanted more land. We wanted to drill more wells. And we developed the very large reserve base, and we had a lot of production. And then we built the Elmworth plant, a huge plant. And then there were 5 or 6 other plants that we built in the Alberta and BC side of the Deep Basin.
Was it a challenge to grow so much?
It was. We had made up our mind, number one, that we were going to really, really search for the very best people. So we never, ever had an HR department that was in charge of hiring. Every time we would hire somebody, we would say, you're part of the HR department. Now, we had an HR department that wrote the checks and did the administration, but we searched for really good people from day one. And we had a very elaborate system of hiring people, different things we did. And it was a very important part of our company. And we ended up with a wonderful, not 100%, but fundamentally, we ended up with a real winning team. And we ended up with several hundred people, 300, 400, 500, 600 people, and big operation in Grand Prairie. And, but we were always exceedingly proud of our team. Yeah.
A lot of the CanHunter assets are now in the hands of companies like Tourmaline, Peyto, ConocoPhillips, who have taken advantage of new technology. Do you ever think what would have happened if you had had that type of technology?
The problem we had was there was a difficult time. Horizontal drilling started and multi-stage fracking. That all started in the late 80s and into the 90s. And Brookfield ended up owning Noranda. They ended up owning Canadian Hunter. But Brookfield was fundamentally, it's a wonderful, wonderful company and very generous. But they weren't an oil and gas producing company back then. They were a finance company. And they were a huge and successful one. Jack Cockwell and Trevor Eaton was involved back in those days. Jack's still alive. And we had a wonderful relationship with them. But then we got an offer for way above what it was trading for.
Yeah.
And so they sold it. We understood that. But we never got to capitalize on the horizontal drilling.
Exactly.
Because they sold it before the horizontal drilling and multi-stage fracking really took root. And if we had held on to it, I've always felt that with the multi-stage fracking, we could have been a full giant. But I've never felt badly about that. I mean, we had a great 28 years, and we made deep friendships, and we all had pride in what we'd achieved and what we were doing. I mean, the company was very involved in the community, and we always supported that. Jose was at the YMCA playing squash and stuff almost every day, and many of them have gone on to spectacular careers, both in the U.S. and in Canada.
Did you ever think about restarting a company in the 2000s with the new technology?
Yeah, no, because, I'm 90, so I was over 70 then. I was born in 33, so I was around 65, 70. John moved down to Denver, and John got involved with some projects in different parts of Colorado and elsewhere. But I always stayed in Calgary. And so I never gave any thought. I participated with some resources with young startups from Canadian Hunter, but I've been there, done that, and I wasn't interested in starting a new company.
Do you ever notice a new well being drilled on your old places?
Yeah. We see that. And a lot of our young people started their own company and took advantage of different parts of it and their knowledge. But my interests kind of went through a change, and I got heavily, heavily involved in a whole bunch of not-for-profits and other projects in the city.
You sold CanHunter in the year 2000, 2001, like we mentioned, for approximately $3 billion.
Yeah, between 3 and 3.5.
So why did you sell CanHunter?
Well, it wasn't our decision. We went public, and then Brookfield owned the Canadian Hunter after they bought Noranda. And then we went public, and people like Prudential down in New York own big, big chunks of our company. And once you're a public company, we're not privately owned anymore. And so Burlington and there were several other companies looking at us, but Burlington came in with a huge offer. And like 40-50% above what it was trading at. And I'm sorry, but that was so profitable that the decision wasn't ours. If it was my decision, I wouldn't sold because it was like part of my family. And we could just see the very tip of the horizontal drilling starting. We didn't know enough about it. We tried some of it ourselves, but it was primitive technology. And we were just 5 or 6 or 10 years too early. And so we weren't able to capitalize on that.
There are many CEOs at public companies nowadays who would probably like to pick your brain on the Deep Basin. Do they ever call you for advice?
The young ones do. The big ones, I mean, I know people like Murray Edwards and the others, and they're good. They're friends, but they're big enough. They don't need any advice. Anyway, they're in the oil sands. I never had any. You'd never come to me for the oil sands. We never had an interest in the oil sands. But we have but the young ones I've worked with and still work with one or two of the young ones, the startups.
Pretty high consulting rate.
No. And I enjoy the friendship as much as the operation.
Maybe before we get to some current events, you and Mr. John Masters wrote a book titled The Hunters, Searching for Oil and Gas in Western Canada. What was that book and why did you write it?
John loved to write, and he was a good writer. And he wanted to leave a record of the building of Canadian Hunter. And so I've got copies of the book still. And he wrote it just because he wanted to have a written record of what he and I had collaborated on and to pay the proper respect to the people that were contributed to that, and also to people like that, Miranda and others that we worked with. And that was great. And it was a passion of John's, and he was really good at it, really good at it.
Well, that's a lot of Can Hunter questions. Maybe a couple current events, a couple questions on that.
Sure.
Through the years, you've been involved with the YMCA in Calgary. Why did you get involved with the YMCA?
Because I stayed there when I came out of school. When I landed here with my car, I can remember walking into the Y right over here. It's long gone now. And staying there and then walking to friends' houses like an hour or an hour and a half. And so then I got involved in leadership at the Y. In fact, it was young Herald newspaper boys that was delivering the Calgary Herald on the Beltline. And they would come in every Friday night and we'd have spend an evening in the gymnasium and playing basketball and swimming down in the swimming pool in the basement and et cetera. And then from that emerged more and more involvement with the Y. And finally, a fellow named Fred McKinnon, who was the CEO of Triad, the big British company, he was on the board and he talked me into running on the board. And so I got on the board and then became heavily involved in the camp. In fact, our twin girls, were the first two girls signed up at the camp. And I made a very impassioned plea at the board. It used to be a boys' camp, and that it should be co-ed, and we should have girls and boys. And that passed at the board, and then I signed them up right that day. And I've been heavily involved in many elements of the Y, the building of different Ys. And Wayne Perkins, who just passed away within the last 2 weeks, I could recognize him. He became the CEO of the Y, and he and I worked together. He came up through the camp. So I've been involved in building the Eau Claire Y. I was chairman for a number of years. I was fundraising for years on many. I'll bet I was involved in 5 or 6 fundraising efforts for the Y over many, many years. So it was a big part of our life.
Do you think your early experiences at the Y shaped your philanthropic philosophy?
Yeah, but mainly driven by kids and youth. And the camp played a big role because our camp used to be north of the highway on Hector Lake. And then the Aboriginals wished to develop it which was the right thing to do, into a tourist center. So we had to buy it. We bought a new camp, and that's the one that we presently have just south of the Trans-Canada Highway. And it's a 1,500-acre camp, and it's a wonderful camp. And so I was involved in buying that. And we looked at all kinds of different sites. And so I've been in, and then you mentioned swimming. I got involved in swimming, and it's been a big chunk of our life.
This episode is brought to you by Upgrade Labs. Upgrade Labs offers a comprehensive range of cutting-edge performance and recovery services that have been proven to optimize your health in minutes, not hours. Whether it's accelerating muscle mass and bone density or addressing injury and inflammation, start your experience by booking a free cell health analysis at upgradelabs.com/Calgary. This podcast is brought to you by Energy United. Energy United is an organization with a mission to promote practical energy policy across Canada. Energy United is building a community of Canadians that are passionate about Canada's natural gas and oil industry and are willing to take action. Energy United is driving change on issues that matter, all the way from the carbon tax to the emissions cap. Join Energy United to make a difference at energyunited.ca. Among other projects you've worked on is the Green Line and the challenges that project has had. From your perspective, what has gone wrong?
Lack of pre-planning. And that's all-encompassing. Remember, you may not remember, but we've talked about the Green Line from the 1980s and 90s. It's been on the line for a long time. And then the problem was that the politicians back in 2016, 2014, politicians always loved to make announcements. So they made an announcement that they were going to build this Green Line 44 kilometers from Seaton in the South Health Campus to 160th Avenue North, including 2 1 billion tunnels under the Bow River. And they were going to build the whole thing for $4.65 billion. But that number was pulled right out of the air. There was never any pre-planning. And so then there was the 2013 flood. And I really became anxious that tunnels under the floodplain of downtown Calgary are very, very risky and very, very dangerous. In fact, I've done a lot of work with the Aga Khan organization over the years and built schools in East Africa and what have you. And I was in the Mayor Naheed's office along with Steve Allen, a friend of mine, and they were still planning these tunnels under the Bow River. $1 billion to go north, $1 billion to go south. And in what Michael Thompson, who good guy and the manager of the Green Line and from the city's point of view, announced that they were going to bridge. They've given up on tunnels under the Bow. They're going to go over with bridges. And the mayor said, why? Because they're too risky and they're too expensive. And they should have had that figured out 10 years before that. And the fundamental problem with these big projects is if you shortchange the planning and you jump into the project, you're going to make a huge mistakes. And the politicians want to jump into the project. And we had good technical people, the people at Transit Calgary and people that work for the city, but they never got the opportunity to spend 1 or 2 or 3 years planning the details of the Green Line. So we started off on the wrong track. And everything is kind of like, for instance, these cars we've got. I was just looking at it this morning. The cars that we've built over our very successful career with the LRT are Siemens cars that are built in Germany. But the ones for the new one that are built in Spain. and they're ground loading cars. They're not platform loading cars. That simple decision is going to, you need new equipment, you need new barns, you need new trained mechanics. They're different types of cars. And then they're very inefficient because they're incompatible with our present fleet. That decision will have cost us all in the near term, $300 to $500 million. And the inefficiency will be with us forever. And that is just one element. We were a one-trick pony. We did a lot of work, and we were extremely concerned about drilling tunnels under downtown Calgary. And the CPR had thought about building a tunnel for their main line years and years ago. Rod Sykes, who was worked for the CPR before he was mayor, and they gave that up. They said, it's too risky under Calgary. And so that's the main thing that we were interested in. And we had a big group. We had almost 2,000 people on their email group. And when we had social media, and we gave speeches, and we talked to the councillors and blah, blah, blah. So now they've decided not to put tunnels in downtown Calgary. And this morning they announced that they're going to build the first phase from the convention center down to Shepherd. But really, there's no traffic between the convention center and down to Shepherd. And I'm very, very worried that this thing is going to end up, this 4.65 is going to morph to between 20 and 25, maybe even $30 billion before it's all over.
A growing city needs transportation. So
correct.
What do you think?
But the problem is, when you spend that much money, there's a whole bunch of other things you can't do. They come off the table, and it's going to haunt us for a long time. I'm not downtown Calgary. I mean, this downtown is very unique. Calgary, if you look at all those buildings, that's energy built. Because when I moved to Calgary, everybody had that. I mean, Shell was here, Esso was there, Gulf was there, Texaco was there, Mobil was there. We were all downtown, and then the bankers and the lawyers and the service people all came downtown with us. And so we're very, very concentrated downtown, much more so than most cities. They all have different downtowns around. So we need public transportation. We've got to think about what is doable. And I believe in public transportation, but we've got to do it in a sensible, pragmatic way. Otherwise, we'll shortchange all the other things we should be doing. And there'll be billions of dollars spent. Now, this, not just in the construction, but in the operation. And so all we're saying is it's so big, so huge. We've got to get it right.
In summary, it's a good idea. It just needs to be affordable.
That's right. I mean, and we should be planning these things. Lots of people will tell you that. And I held, when it got going, Jeff Fielding was the city manager. And he asked me, well, he was nervous about tunnels under the bow in the city. And so he said, what can we do? And we held some meetings at City Hall with people that have built big medical projects. And they all emphasized the pre-planning. You've got to sit down and think about these things and spend some extra time on the planning. And think about the different options and cost them out and be realistic. And we got started on the wrong path, and it's very hard when you do that.
Well, we could talk for hours on your various projects outside of Can Hunter, but maybe what is top 7 over 70?
I was listening to the radio one day, and they had the top 30 under 30 and the top 20 under 20. And the top, et cetera, et cetera. And then I was noticing that, like, I'm 91 now, I'll be 92 soon, but I was noticing how much that so many of my associates were doing a senior age. And so I thought, we've got to honor these people that are doing something new after the age of 70. And so we've now held 3 galas, sold out. We did a great one down in Medicine Hat. It was sold out. We're now looking at elsewhere in Canada, and we have a couple of cities that we're working with to spread it from coast to coast. And they have it the top 70 over 70. And because it's amazing what people are doing. They're living longer. Neurologically, their brain power is still very valid. Now, we all understand that at the end of the day, we're all going to end up the same way. But what people are doing in their 70s and 80s and 90s is fantastic. And they need to be honored. So I just felt, and not just me, it was, we put together a team. I'm having supper with some of them tonight. We've got to honor what these seniors, because then they can be an inspiration for other seniors to get engaged. And it's been a real success, fantastic success.
Any other projects you want to highlight?
Let me just tell you the project I'm working on right now. And when we look at the wildfires that have taken place at Fort McMurray, at Jasper in Southern California, Los Angeles, I became very, very sensitive to the Bow Valley. And the Bow Valley, 20% of Canada's exports go on that CPR railroad through Canmore and Banff. And the Bow Valley, the Banff National Park, is our iconic national park. It kind of represents tourism from coast to coast. I mean, yes, we got the Mounties and yes, we got things like Calgary Stampede, but Banff National Park is an iconic place. And so I started studying the potential for a wildfire in the Bow Valley. And we now have met with everybody, including I know Keith Creel, the CEO of CP, Kansas City, because I was on the board of CN for years and years, and he worked for his chief operating officer on CN, and he's a great guy, and he's really worried about the Bow Valley. We have the Trans-Canada Highway, which is an artery of commerce, as well as tourism and what have you, trucks. I mean, thousands of trucks going back and forth. So I started asking people, what are they doing about measuring the danger, doing the mitigation of the valley, and planning for the possibility of a wildfire coming down that valley? Because the valley burns every 70, 80, 90, 100 years naturally. And we've stopped a lot of that burning because it's Banff National Park. And so we've been very aggressive in putting out fires. So I'm working on this every day now. And we've talked to all kinds of people. And as I mentioned, I had a meeting with the Premier earlier this week. And she is leading this as a priority but it's multi-jurisdictional. Ottawa is responsible for Banff National Park, and then we've got the province, and we've got Canmore, and we've got Banff, and we've got Lake Louise. We've got commercial interests in terms of Lafarge and others. We've got forestry operations, and we have to have cooperation. And so I've been working on that.
Well, that's the Can Hunter days. That's some of the stuff you're working on now. Maybe a few questions to wrap up. Do any leaders stick out through the years?
In the oil and gas business, there have been wonderful leaders. And during the National NEP back in 1980, there were a whole bunch of leaders that fought that national policy. But in the community, there have been some spectacular examples of leadership. There's a woman by the name of Janice McTighe. She runs something called Renfrew. Renfrew deals with children with severe challenges, mental challenges, and other challenges. She's 83. Way back, I've been working with her for 35 years, but 50 years ago, She had a child that was severely challenged. She went to the government, said, do you have any programs? Because she was living on her own then with this child. They said, we don't have programs for you. She said, okay, I'll build a school for myself. And she built her own school. She's now building her fourth school. She's handling hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children and families with severe challenges. She's a wonderful leader. I think of Paul Gianellia, who built the Charlottetown Bridge. He lives in Cochrane, or did live in Cochrane. And that was the biggest cold water bridge in the world the year he built it. And they had 4,500 people at it. They built it on time, on budget, 26-mile bridge between PEI and New Brunswick. He's a great leader. Politically, the leader that I felt showed me the way was Peter Lougheed. He was a wonderful leader. I've got others that I've worked with, but that's just the name of a few.
Throughout your career, has there been a most rewarding project or initiative you've been involved with?
I would say Canadian Hunter was in my business career is number one. But I would say in my community life, the Calgary Academy is number one. The Calgary Academy is now 44 years old, and it's for children that learn in special ways. They're not dumb kids, they're smart kids. They just don't learn the same way as one size fits all is dying in the world. And that's true of education. So we have a school, we have 750 kids. We're doing research projects on precision learning and other elements of education. And it's been, we have wonderful leadership. Greg Bass is the CEO, but we've got research going on. We got wonderful teachers. It's been a great joy because what it is doing is taking children that are smart kids, are good kids, but they somehow aren't functioning to their proper level. And now we're starting to learn that's very normal. Let's deal with it. And it's been very successful. I'll be there at 4:00 this afternoon.
At 91 years old, you're still here doing things like this you're optimistic, with tons of energy, taking on new projects. So what motivates you nowadays? How do you do it?
Well, I don't golf. So that gives me an extra day a week to work with. But my family, I email my family every morning. Every morning I've been in touch with my family. Every single morning. And if I don't contact them by 9 or 10, they'll contact me and say, what's wrong? What's up? I think you have to be optimistic and realist, but optimistic. I think it's good for your health. I think it's good for your quality of life. I don't believe in just going down to Arizona and eating, drinking, and playing golf. That just isn't what I want to do. I look forward to the seasons. I look forward to the winter, and I look forward to the spring, and then summer, fall, and all the work. I love Calgary, and I love being up in the mountains on the weekends. I used to climb and cross-country ski and go for a week with Hans Mosier with skins and what have you, doing all that, but I can't do that now. But there's lots of things I can do, and I do them. And so I'm very, very interested in keeping engaged.
And we are in downtown Calgary today, as an example. It's doing this podcast, so it's impressive. What advice would you give to a 30-year-old Jim Gray?
To be engaged, to be curious, to be interested in things, and to reach out to ask people what their advice is. I work a lot with younger people, and there's opportunities every day to get engaged with things. And rather than just sit at home and whine and complain about everything, do something. And like my wife said, what are you going to do about it? Well, do something. I learned in 100 days that You can talk to anybody. If they'll be happy they talked with you. And so I really believe in that. And I've got all kinds of things that I'm working on. I mean, that little brochure I gave you lists all the projects, and the people inspire you that you talk with. I like that. And because I think it's your quality of life, and it's good for your health to stay busy. And it's good for your brain to stay active. Now, bad things happen for which you have no control. That's just a given. You just play the game as not aggressively, but as actively as you can. And to me, it's very exceedingly rewarding. So I guess my advice is be involved, and don't just sit around. Be involved and find people to be involved with. Build bridges, and build bridges before you need them, not when you need them.
Right. That's a lot of questions. I really appreciate your time today. Unless there's anything else you want to add, we can end the formal conversation there.
Okay. Well, great.
Hello, listeners out there. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Hopefully the episode provided some insights. If you enjoyed the show, check out trose.ca where more episodes are yet to come. You can also subscribe to the podcast where your token of support is much appreciated. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.